Okay, psyc100 students, our third and final video for chapter 15, psychological disorders. There's a lot of material, so that's why there's so many videos. Well, we left off with the ticker. We talked about Freddie the catatonic schizophrenia, the ticker, residual. And residual is a type of schizophrenia where it's not full-blown schizophrenia, but there are some characteristics that are released through a traumatic event. And of course, his traumatic event was having open heart surgery at such a young age. The next case is called Rancho Grande. Now, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the song Rancho Grande, but it's an old tune. It's about growing up on a big ranch. That's the name. And I met Rancho Grande, a 40-something-year-old Mexican-American male, when I worked at an agency called Cristo Rey. When I took over psychological services there, I inherited a small caseload from the previous director, and one of them was Rancho Grande. And when I got his file, the first thing I noticed was that it was huge. It was really thick. And I thought, oh no, this is going to be a really complicated case. Well, it turns out it used to be complicated when he was diagnosed with undifferentiated schizophrenia in his 20s. He was in and out of the hospital, and every time you're in the hospital, you generate a lot of paperwork. Right now it's done electronically, but if they print it out, it's huge. Fortunately, he'd been doing so well that he had only seen his previous therapist just once a month, and that was just for medication review. So all that the big thickness was from early hospitalization, but he had managed his undifferentiated schizophrenia pretty well since then. So here's a typical 50-minute session we would have together, myself and Rancho Grande. So how are you doing? Good. Still taking your medications? Yes. Any problems with the meds? No. Any issues you want to talk about? No, everything's good. Okay, we're pretty much done. In 5 minutes, we're done with our therapy session. But I'd like to learn. That's probably why I'm in the business of education. I'm always learning. And so I started asking questions like, I noticed you had all kinds of voices and things like that when you were younger, but you've been taking your meds. I said, do you ever still hear the voices? He says, yeah. I said, when do you hear them? He says, when I get stressed out. He says, let me give you an example. He says, I play for a band. We do local gigs, quinceañeras, dances at the VFW hall, stuff like that. And I play electric guitar for the band. And I usually like to get there early. And he says when he gets there early and nobody else is there, he's got his guitar, he's got his amplifier, and he's fine until people start showing up. And once people start showing up, he starts getting nervous. And that's when the voices start to come in his head. And he realizes medication isn't working. I said, what do you do? He says, I play the song Rancho Grande. He says, ya, Rancho Grande. Feel free to jump in. Ya. And the people in the audience, they assume he's just a guy testing his equipment, warming up. They have no idea that undifferentiated schizophrenic is experiencing auditory hallucinations. And he's trying to get rid of them because his meds aren't working. And it works. After playing the song softly to himself once or twice, the voices go away and he calms down. That's Rancho Grande. The last case study is called Madonna and the Police, and it deals with paranoid schizophrenia. Now, with Madonna and the Police, it involves two brothers. They're African American. The younger brother was about 24 years old, and the older brother was about 26. I met the younger brother first. It was a hot summer day at the agency at Cristo Rey, and this agency didn't have any air conditioning. You just opened up the windows and hoped for a blast of air, but usually the air was hot anyways. And the younger brother climbed up the steps to where my office was, and he says, you have to help me. My brother needs to be hospitalized. He's paranoid schizophrenic. He's been in the hospital before. he's got to go to the hospital right now. He's out of his mind. I kind of like with the ticker's parents, I said, okay, I can't just hospitalize him. I have to assess him. Where is he at? He's downstairs. Okay, let's go get him. He said, word of warning. Whatever you do when you hospitalize my brother, do not involve the police because he's paranoid schizophrenic. And if the police are involved, something bad's going to happen. Someone's going to get hurt. I said, okay, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So right then I'm ready to go downstairs. I get a phone call. Pedroza, we need you downstairs. There's a guy down here about to get into a fight with one of our volunteers. On my way. Now, why they always call me when there was an emergency, I don't know. Maybe they knew about the Spider-Man thing. I'm not sure. But I went down there, and sure enough, it's his brother. Okay. Where his younger brother was 24 years old, stood about 5'6", weighed about 230 pounds. His older brother, who was 26, stood about 6'4" and was about 320 pounds. He's a really big fella. Now, he was just leaning against the wall, and I'm sure the volunteer came up to him and said, can I help you with something? And he lost it. And luckily, there was no blows thrown or anything, but he's paranoid schizophrenic. He's delusional. So, trying to have a normal conversation with him wasn't going to happen. So I managed to get him upstairs, and unlike the ticker who sort of kept things together and sort of pretending he was normal until he sort of lost it, the Madonna and the police older brother, he was out of his mind. I mean, he was literally pacing in my office. I couldn't even get him to sit down. So I tried to talk him to go into the hospital, where he refuses. He's been to the hospital many times. And he finally agrees to go to the hospital only if his brother can come with him to the hospital, and only if I take him. Now, have you ever find yourself saying yes to something you want to say no to? That's exactly how I felt. I felt like, oh my gosh, we don't do transport here. But then I think about the alternatives. Do I stick him on the bus with his brother? Will they make it to the hospital? Do I stick him in a taxi with his brother? Do they make it to the hospital? So I said, okay, let's go to the parking lot and let's get into my little mini Chevy S10 pickup truck. Now, I'm not familiar. I don't know if you know about the pickup truck, but it's a very small pickup truck. It only sat 2 people in the front seat. Had a stick shift 5-speed in the middle. Okay, so I'm about 40 pounds heavier at the time. So I sit in the driver's seat. The 5'6", 230-pound brother sits in the middle, even though there is no seat. That's where the stick shift is. The 6'4", 320-pound brother sits in the passenger seat. My truck goes down. I now have a lowrider. I'm not sure if we even closed the passenger door. I start up the truck and I'm trying to shift it into gear, but I can only shift it into second gear because there's so much body in there. There's not enough room to even shift even higher. So we're driving low and slow. And did you ever notice when you're having a good time passes by so fast, like at Disneyland? You're like, what? We got to go home. It took forever to get to that hospital. So we finally halfway there, right? The schizophrenic brother reaches over and turns up the volume of a song that's on. I think it was a Madonna song, like a virgin. He cranks it up full volume and it's blasting like a virgin, right? And I'm thinking, okay, if that calms him down, that's great, So I'm just trying to drive. The music's blasting. Right about that time, a police car comes up next to my truck. And I'm thinking, oh no, this is it. I can see the headlines in the paper the next day. Therapist killed, everybody else okay, right? No, the police don't even pay attention to us. They just pass us by and they keep on going. Part of me is relieved. The other part of me is like, take over, right? Why did I get myself in this spot? We finally get to the hospital. We get out of the truck. The truck pops back up because all the weight's out. We go into the hospital, and right away he says, I don't want to check myself in. I thought, oh my goodness, there's no way you and your brother getting back in my truck and we're going through this all over again. So I let the hospital personnel take over and convince him to check himself in, which he eventually does. So I wanted to talk about prognosis. Prognosis is, will these folks get any better? And if you notice, with Freddie the catatonic, I've given a poor prognosis. A couple weeks after I quit that job, I happened to drive down the street where the group home was, and guess who I saw on the porch, holding his pipe, standing like a statue? I found out from some of the employees there that Freddie had never gotten any visitors, family or friends, during the time he was there, which is pretty sad. So I don't see his condition improving greatly. As far as the ticker, his prognosis, I've given him a good prognosis because he had no family history of mental illness and certainly no episodes before his open heart surgery. So with a little bit of guidance, once he gets used to dealing with his medications and so forth, dealing with a pacemaker, he may even go back to school. With Rancho Grande, I've given the diagnosis of good because here is a person who in his 20s we would say his prognosis was poor because he was in and out of hospitals. But now in his 40s, he had done so well, he was compliant with coming to his appointments, taking his meds, and he even found a very non-destructive way of ridding himself of his symptoms. For Madonna and the police, I have mixed feelings about that from between poor and fair prognosis, primarily because here's a fella who had been, according to his brother who I talked with afterwards, in and out of hospitals multiple times, sometimes involving the police, sometimes not. As a matter of fact, at the hospital I dropped him off, they recognized him immediately, right? Fortunately, they were able to talk him in to sign himself in. But this is the kind of case where a lot of individuals slip through the cracks. We see them now on our city streets pushing carts, talking to themselves. Sometimes family lose track of them. Sometimes family wash their hands of them, thinking there's nothing they can do. They don't want my help. So the prognosis is pretty poor. But I put fair because he still has one brother who wasn't ready to give up on him. And the brother realized, what typically would happen was they would hospitalize him maybe for a night or two. They give him some medications. They release him as soon as possible because hospitals are very expensive. And then they would expect him to take his meds. And at 6'4", 320 pounds, when he didn't want to take his meds, because a lot of us don't like taking meds, right? Who's going to make him? So hopefully all the cases got better. So what causes schizophrenia? That's up for debate. This notion that we have a genetic predisposition, and with the wrong stressors, that's what sets off our ticking time bomb of schizophrenia. We can make that genetic argument for a lot of different ailments that we may suffer from, things from like depression, high blood pressure, diabetes. All the more reason to take good care of ourselves, especially during these trying times, for sure. Okay, so let's go over the answers for the next exam. I promise you 5 questions, and you're going to get 5 questions. The first one was to tell the story of Mrs. Talkalot. Remember, you want to do this in detail. And be sure to specify how the term stigma was related to this case study. And we know that played a significant role in her lack of sharing information about her own family. The next few are probably what you expected. Describe the case study of Freddie the catatonic. Be sure to include his diagnosis and his prognosis. Be sure to do both of those. And since you have more time, I want you to give plenty of detail to these answers. It's not like you're taking this in the class and you only have a few minutes to talk about each one. I want you to describe the case study of the ticker, as well as the diagnosis and prognosis of that case study. I want you to do the same thing with Rancho Grande, diagnosis and prognosis. And finally, Madonna and the police, diagnosis and prognosis. I wish you well. I'm looking forward to our last chapter lecture, chapter 16. Take care.